Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our annual La Trobe Myeloma Update Seminar, which is again national this year thanks to this online platform. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, being the whole of Australia, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today. My name is Emma Hubans, and along with my colleague Laura Jones, we make up the myeloma support nurse team here in Victoria. We have two sessions today. In the first session, Professor Prince will be giving us an overview of myeloma. Then we will have a 5-minute break period. And then we'll move on to our second session where Miles will give an overview of new therapies in the myeloma space. And then we'll have an interactive Q&A session chaired by myeloma support nurse Laura Jones. Please submit any of your questions throughout the seminar into the chat box below this video. You'll have to log in with your name, or if you wish to remain anonymous, just log in with the name anonymous. You can ask any questions throughout the seminar and we'll endeavour to answer them at the end. If we do not answer your questions today, you can email them through to our myeloma support nurses at nurses@myeloma.org.au, and we will endeavour to answer them in the coming days. This seminar will also be recorded and available to playback on our website in approximately 1 week's time. At the end of the seminar, it would be greatly appreciated if you could take a few minutes to fill out our evaluation form. Your feedback is valuable and enables the ongoing improvement on our online seminars to ensure we are providing the best possible seminars we can. Without further ado, I will now introduce Miles. Miles is a Professor of Medicine at both Melbourne and Monash Universities and Professor Director of Molecular Oncology and Cancer Immunology at Epworth Healthcare and Director of the Centre for Blood Cell Therapies at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne. Miles has been involved in dozens of clinical trials of new therapies for blood cancers and has a very active research program in both clinical and laboratory research involving stem cells, cell engineering, and cancer immunology. He was the chairman of the Medical Scientific Advisory Group to Myeloma Australia from 2008 until early 2002 and remains a board member of Myeloma Australia. He is also on the steering committee member of the Multiple Myeloma Hub. Miles has published over 450 peer-reviewed manuscripts and is a reviewer for numerous scientific journals, as well as being a medical advisor to a variety of government and pharmaceutical bodies. Thank you so much, Miles, for taking your time to join us today.
Thanks so much, Emma. Just checking that you can hear me okay. Great. So look, I will be just shout out to me if there's any troubles with hearing me. So look, I always start this presentation off very generally and say, look, it's very much all about you in the audience. This is a presentation for you to get the information that you want. And it is a bit difficult because I know that there's a number of you who have just recently been diagnosed with multiple myeloma and others who've been coming to this seminar for what is almost 15 years now. Thalidomide was really prompted this seminar. It was first used back in 2020, believe it or not. It's 22 years ago. Thalidomide was a drug that moved us on from just melphalan, the only chemotherapy. And we've gone from having one drug in 1999, before thalidomide was discovered, to now having over 15 drugs for myeloma. So this presentation's changed, and some of you with myeloma have been here all along. And so I will give a background for the first few minutes to talk about myeloma, but please use the chat because I can see it here on my other screen. And if there are specific questions, I'm very happy to be interrupted, and also there will be plenty of time at the end to discuss. So hopefully you won't get too distracted. I just want to thank Helen Chapman for these cartoons. She always likes to keep the audience excited. And the point being is that I want it to be interesting for you. And so please don't hesitate along the way to interrupt. So I think it is important to just reflect for a few minutes. Well, I'll talk for the next 15 minutes or so a bit about the background of myeloma. In the guts of it is that on the left-hand side there, you can see that myeloma is in the bone marrow. And the bone marrow in the adult is predominantly in the pelvis and in the spine and in the sternum and ribs. And it's really a honeycomb of bone, and stuffed in that honeycomb is where the blood's made. And on the top right, you can see here what we imagine as the bone marrow. It's really a tropical fish tank of red cells and different types of white cells. And there's different types of white cells that do different things. But ultimately, their job is to fight infection. And a number of you heard my analogy to the military, in that the white cells are like the military. Their job is to kill viruses, bacteria, parasites, fungus, and we've evolved. And I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of white cells, but fundamentally, those white cells' job is like the military, to kill. But like the military, it kills in different ways. And so there are neutrophils and lymphocytes and monocytes all killing, like the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, in different ways. And largely, the neutrophils are really important. They're very important cells. They're relatively stupid, but they're important. If you cut yourself or prick yourself with a thorn in the garden, the neutrophils rush to that area and they blow themselves up, producing toxins, which then and chemicals which kill the bacteria or virus, or at least attempt to. But what about the long-term immune system? Well, the lymphocytes really drag those cells back to the lymph glands, and they process them, and then they can produce things like T cells or B cells, and B cells produce antibodies. And these antibodies are actually produced by a mature B cell. A lymphocyte becomes a plasma cell, which becomes little antibody production factories. So those fried egg looking purpley cells are the plasma cells. And these plasma cells normally produce antibodies. And that allows the immune system to both remember and then attack very quickly if we get, for example, infected with chickenpox, say, a second time. And so what happens in myeloma, I just want you to focus on the middle of the slide. If you can imagine, there's a cut through there of the vertebra. And what happens in myeloma is that those plasma cells grow in an uncontrolled way. So for some reason, they become relatively immortal. They should be like a leaf on a tree. After a certain period of time, basically shrivel up and die. And all white cells have a determined lifespan. But what happens in a lot of blood cancers is that their growth is uncontrolled. And that's a really important concept, because it makes sense as to why these cells can live in your body for so long. Certainly when I went through medical school, the concept for all cancers was one bad cell turned into two, and then two turns into four, and then four turns into eight. Well, that's true to an extent, that sort of clonal growth. But equally, cells that are relatively immortal will build up like silt in a river in the bone marrow. And so one of the problems with myeloma is these plasma cells don't want to die. And so that they grow. And if you focus back to the middle slide there of the middle of the slide there at the vertebra, you can see they form these little lakes, these little collections of plasma cells, 20, 30, 50. And then if they're allowed to grow longer, they eventually can cause large deposits in the vertebra. And you can see on that bottom right-hand corner that they can cause the vertebra, that honeycomb, to break down, making the bones very brittle and weak. And you can get things like crush fractures. Or if you look up in the X-ray at the top right-hand corner, that's a growth of a plasma cell in one of the long bones in the body. And so you can get this growth of so-called plasmacytomas. And so the common presentation of myeloma is bone disease, which is caused by the growth of these plasma cells. The other thing that myeloma does is it disturbs the immune function. And so you can see here those plasma cells produce these antibodies. And these antibodies are fork-like proteins. And there's a little cartoon at the bottom right-hand corner. And those are, the red are the heavy chains, and the blue are the light chains of an antibody. So these plasma cells are these antibody factories. Now, normally if you've without myeloma, we have specific plasma cells for every thing that we're protected against. So if it's been what you've been vaccinated in childhood, so measles, mumps, rubella, you'll have antibodies to all of those. Common cold, COVID, for example, we'll have thousands of these antibodies floating around in our body. What happens in myeloma is that you end up having just, you have these antibodies behind it, but you produce these junk antibodies, not directed against anything specific. So I won't go into the detail, but the top right-hand corner is just what we call a gel, where we do protein electrophoresis. We separate out all the body proteins. And that little, where it says M protein there, is just this abnormal spike that we see. And so for those of you who are aware of myeloma, and what their M protein is, that will go up and down depending on whether the disease is getting worse or hopefully responding, and then eventually get very close to zero where it becomes undetectable. So the light chains can do exactly the same thing. And the difference between light chain myeloma or what is the standard intact myeloma, that it's no different in the disease, it's just a different way of monitoring. And so the myeloma can also cause kidney damage because those proteins can get stuck in the kidney, or there can be growth of the abnormal cells in the kidney. But usually it's irritation of the kidney because of this abnormal protein that's floating around. And so, of course, the symptoms will relate to where the damage is. So bone pain, and you can get leaching out of calcium from the bones, and that can cause hypercalcemia or high calcium levels. Patients can get overload of the plasma cells in the bone marrow. So like weeds in a garden, the plasma cells basically take over that honeycomb of bone. And that means that the other blood counts, like the red cells or the neutrophils that I talked about, those important white cells, can go down, or the platelets can go down, and people can get bleeding problems. And so you can get bone marrow failure. But also the normal immune cells, B cells, are suppressed while the bad one, plasma cells, grow. And that can lead to infections. And so that's often the constellation of myeloma. And the important thing to remember is that it's often in older people. The average age of myeloma is about 65 to 70. So the classic presentation is where people have bone pain, they fall over, they fall off their bike, they have back pain, and suddenly the penny clicks, the penny drops, should I say. Suddenly the penny drops, and the doctor says, this could be myeloma. And so the protein testing is done and the diagnosis is made. We don't know what causes myeloma. It is increasing, and it may be increasing because of better detection. I'll come to that in a second. Slightly more common in males. And the question's often been raised, is it increasing in younger people? Well, probably not substantially. There might be a fraction increase around the world, but generally it's increasing because of our aging population and our better detection. We don't know what causes myeloma. There's been lots of associations with agricultural workers, i.e. possibly pesticides, radiation, benzene exposure, and it has been investigated for looking at whether being overweight or low vitamin D or not enough fish oils. Well, these are being looked at, but they're not strong associations. So I often tell my patients, don't beat yourself up trying to find a cause, because it's extremely rare that we're able to identify something in a patient's life that's caused their myeloma. So although it can be seen in farmers and agricultural workers, I see it just as commonly in people who've lived, in the city all their lives. What's interesting is the genetics. What is bizarre about myeloma is that it is the most common blood cancer in Black Africans, both in Africa and America. Now, that's something to do with sort of broader genetics, but it's also extremely common around places like the Mediterranean, Italy, Greece, Egypt, Israel are common areas. You'll see there in red where the highest levels are in terms of incidence rates per 100,000. So it's not just population. And you can see that Australia is right up there in bright red amongst North America and Northern Europe as common. Part of that is because of our good health system, because although it's common in Africa, the health system's such that people are not getting their protein testing, it's not being picked up early, etc. So that red diagram is not just a reflection of where it is, but it's also a reflection of where it's being tested and looked for. And so we're seeing a lot more patients with so-called asymptomatic smoldering myeloma, monoclonal gammopathies. I haven't got much time to talk about that. I can happily talk about it later, where the protein level is detectable, but has not developed into myeloma that requires treatment. And that's because the disease is sitting there, slowly building up, as I've said, in the bone marrow, but doesn't cause problems. And that can take many years, indeed decades, to go from first detection to actual treatment. And you can imagine if you were diagnosed in 2001, when all we had was melphalan and maybe thalidomide, and you were able to not be treated for 15 years because the disease was slowly progressing, and then suddenly you're in 2015 or 16, where there's now a whole lot of the new treatments that I'll talk about. So not treating makes a lot of sense as long as we can monitor better, and I'll come back to that. But this has always been the typical pattern of myeloma. So on the left is the so-called asymptomatic monoclonal gammopathy, where there's just a protein, small amount of plasma cells, what we call indolent myeloma or smoldering myeloma. And then what happens is a symptom develops. So you go from the asymptomatic to symptomatic. Asymptomatic means simply no symptoms. Then symptomatic, which is the things I've talked about, the bone pain, etc. And so it's at that point frontline therapy is initiated. And so the myeloma, you can see it in green, it's this concept of it building up. And then with the treatment, it reduces, and then people go into remission, the so-called plateau phase, and then there's a relapse of the myeloma sometime later. And ultimately, what can happen is that people stop responding to the treatment, so-called permanently refractory to the disease. And we want to put that time off for as long as possible. So in the days before new drugs, we really just had chemotherapy. And the cartoon really there is, but living longer may not be right for you, because we are wary of side effects in patients, and remembering that it is in patients that are often older. Average age of 70 or 65 means half the patients are older. So giving patients who are 85 to 90 just chemotherapy was very, very hard, and it really made their life very miserable. And fortunately, we've got a lot of new drugs. And ultimately, the way that we look at the treatment for myeloma is there's chemotherapy, which I'll talk about, and we divide patients up broadly into what we call patients who are suitable to undergo a autologous stem cell transplant, and that's what we call transplant candidates, and people who are fundamentally too frail / old who can't have a transplant, and they're considered non-transplant candidates. And that's how we think about people as soon as we make the diagnosis. Is this someone that can undergo more aggressive type treatment, or wouldn't they cope with that? So this is a bit about what I'm going to talk about today. I won't talk much about the supportive treatments like surgery and radiotherapy, or the bone strengtheners, the so-called bisphosphonates, of which the most common is Zometa. Chemotherapy has some role, but really the only two drugs that we use commonly is a drug called cyclophosphamide, which we tend to use in lowish doses, and melphalan, which we use in high doses as part of the stem cell transplant program. Then there's the non-chemotherapy groups, and don't have to remember all of these, but it's just a way of introduction. There is the so-called immunomodulatory agents that derived from thalidomide. again, I'm not going to talk much about how these drugs work, but fundamentally, they work predominantly by boosting the immune system as well as making the cell commit suicide. So thalidomide and lenalidomide and pomalidomide are part of that group. And every drug has a trade name or a nickname. And so lenalidomide is otherwise called Revlimid. Pomalidomide is otherwise called Pomalyst. Pomalidomide has just gone generic. So it's gone from being just produced by one company to a variety of companies. And so you'll hear more about that because those of you who are on pomalidomide may have to, we have to look at how to avoid patients causing the birth defects. So there's special programs that are associated with licensing and getting that drug and making sure people are aware of the potential teratogenic effects, the birth defects. And so the pomalidomide is now gone generic. So there's going to be a number of companies producing it, and there's going to be a number of specific protocols that people have to sign off on. You don't have to do much, but recognizing that the name Pomalyst is going to be changing because different companies will produce different types of pomalidomide. Proteasome inhibitors is another group, and they're really teaching the cells how to die. They're not poisons per se, but they're making those cells move into a natural death. And that bortezomib, otherwise known as Velcade, carfilzomib. Then there's this new group of monoclonal antibodies, which I'll come to, and then other immune therapies, which I'll talk about later. So before I talk about new drugs in a second, and before we have our little break, the concept is that to kill a cell, we need to know how it grows. And so this didn't work out in the transition, but basically it's talks about cells multiplying. So what happens is chemotherapy blocks the cells. So what happens is that normally with chemo, one cell becomes two, two becomes four. And during that process, the DNA splits. And so during that splitting and doubling of the DNA, chemotherapy gets in and blocks the cell growth. Now, the problem is that can be associated with side effects. So the new drugs that we have aimed at having less side effects. We also want them to be better than chemotherapy and give us better options, because one of the problems that we had was you couldn't keep giving chemo because of the development of resistance. Much like a bacteria gets resistant to antibiotics, well, cancers can get resistant to chemotherapy. So one of the things we're also getting better at is predicting the future, looking at patients with myeloma and saying, this patient will respond well to treatment and likely to be in remission for X number of years. This patient may not. And that may make us or give us information about changing the treatments earlier or predicting how long those treatments are going to last. And finally, there are better ways of following the disease. There are better blood tests and, importantly, better scanning techniques. So all of you who've been involved with myeloma will know that X-rays are being used less. We're using more CT scans to low-dose CTs with less radiation to image. We're also using MRIs a lot more to assess that honeycomb of bone, to look for those little islands of myeloma, and now also is what's called PET scanning. So I'd be pleased and thank you to my colleagues on MSAG, the Medical Scientific Advisory Group to Myeloma Australia, who we've managed to get PET scanning now approved just as the beginning of this month. So it now can be used in myeloma. And it's a very useful test in that you can see on the left-hand side, those black areas are where there's increased sugar activity. And so you can see the brain, which uses a lot of sugar. And you can see that person's right arm, well, their arm, it's their right arm, left to us. And the arm has got lots of myeloma in the bone marrow in the arm. And you can see it's also got disease in the left shoulder. And all of those other little spots are where there are deposits in the bone. And you can see down in their legs, it's active. This is after treatment on the right-hand side where it's all gone, and the only spots are the brain and then where the radioactive material is being excreted from the two kidneys and then through the ureters into the bladder. So the rest of it has completely cleared. So PET scans can be very valuable in evaluating multiple myeloma. And so you may well be asked in the near future to have a PET scan to assess your disease. So this is what I'm going to talk about in the next session. And it's why do we need new drugs? Well, we need new drugs to prolong survival, make people live longer, make people live good and effective and enjoyable lives. Because ultimately relapse is inevitable, but for everybody, every remission is too short. And there are some subtypes of myeloma who don't respond well to standard chemotherapy, and new drugs and ways of killing the myeloma is important. Ultimately, we want to cure the disease, and with these new drugs, we really are starting to talk about the potential to cure myeloma into the future. And we know that this is a disease of average age of 65, and so our drugs have to be directed towards that population. And so we want to improve the quality of life and make the treatment acceptable. So I'm just going to stop there for a few minutes to allow you to get up and have a drink, and just let you know that we'll be spending the next hour or 55 minutes answering questions, and I'll go over some of the new exciting treatments, including some of the immune therapies. I'll hand back over to Emma.
Thank you so much, Miles, for that overview. It's always such a really good refresher for those who have been living with myeloma for a while, and a really good overview introduction to those in the audience who may be newly diagnosed. So as Miles said, we're going to take a short 5-minute break. So please go to the bathroom, grab yourself a cup of tea, and we'll be back in 5 minutes for the next session.
This festive season, we ask you to reach out to your family and friends to support us so that we can keep supporting you. We have, you can give donations in lieu of gifts to your family and friends, and if you do that, we will provide you with a little card that you can send to them explaining that you have donated on their behalf. You can buy some gifts from our gift shop, or book your holiday with Luxury Escapes and use our code Myeloma5. You can also tell your family and friends to support us, and we look forward to seeing you all next year, and we wish you a safe and happy festive season.
Thank you so much again, Miles, for your wonderful presentation on just a really great overview of myeloma, how things have changed since we did this seminar down at La Trobe University. Things have also changed in how we treat myeloma recently, which is what you're going to speak about in your next session. After the session and throughout, if there's any really relevant questions, I'll be asking Miles any of your questions. There's a really wonderful chat box on the page underneath this presentation that you can submit questions to. For any questions that we don't get to answer today, please shoot us an email at nurses@myeloma.org.au, and we'll get to those questions by the end of the week for you. There's also a Q&A evaluation form on the page. So any feedback that you have about today's seminar is really valuable so that we can make future seminars as relevant and valuable for the community as possible. Thank you so much again, Miles, and I'll let you get going.
Thanks, Laura. You can hear me okay? Great. So there's our friends, the fried eggs. And so really when we think about myeloma and its growth, if you can imagine the cells are growing to the right, so there needs a good environment to grow in. And ultimately, this is where drugs like thalidomide, pomalidomide, lenalidomide do affect what we call the microenvironment of the myeloma, the soil in which it grows, and it makes it uncomfortable for these myeloma cells to grow. And so if you've got a conducive environment, then obviously the myeloma will grow well. Similarly, if those cells are dividing well, you'll get increasing growth of the myeloma. At the same time, these cells should be dying. So there should be some element of natural cell death in the plasma cells. And what happens is that often with myeloma, they don't die properly, so that they shift to the right and grow. And so this natural cell death, we want to try and reverse and make it increase so that we reduce the myeloma load. And importantly also, there is important immune control. So the immune system is constantly trying to fight the myeloma, the enemy of this myeloma as it's growing. And that's one of the important aspects of the immune system. And so the immune system is trying to suppress it and keep everything to the left. However, what happens is that that's out of control. So what we can try and do with the new treatments is boost the immune system, enhance natural cell death, which is called apoptosis, reduce replication, and make the environment very uncomfortable for the myeloma. And this is what all these new drugs are about. And so how do we kill a myeloma cell in 2022? Well, there's chemotherapy, and don't put it aside, it's important, and it does kill the myeloma cells as long as that we see it as part of the armamentarium. It wasn't so good when that was the only thing we had, but now if we can add things to it by boosting the T cells, which is the part of the immune system, inducing this so-called apoptosis, this trying to make the cells commit suicide. I'm going to talk about antibody treatment, which I call killing them like eggshells, getting on the outside. And like our body uses antibodies to kill viruses by binding on the outside, we can use antibodies, and we can try and get inside the cell by affecting small molecules. So these small molecules get on the inside of the cell and stop important processes of metabolism, which with the cells without have die because they simply don't have the metabolism to sustain their own growth. And so these are the sorts of drugs that are used there. So we use chemotherapy, cyclophosphamide, melphalan, these T-cell agents, thalidomide, lenalidomide, pomalidomide, we can modify these T cells with these new treatments called bispecific antibodies, and I'll come back to this, otherwise called BiTEs, and CAR T cells, chimeric antigen receptor T cells, which I'll talk about. We've talked about the drugs that induce apoptosis, that's Velcade and carfilzomib, and these new antibodies, particularly this drug daratumumab, that's now approved by the PBS. There's also elotuzumab, which is another antibody that's approved by the PBS, and there's other ways that we can manipulate the antibodies, and I'll talk about that later. And there are important small molecules that are now available. Selinexor is approved by the PBS, and another drug called venetoclax, which is there for research. It's used in other blood cancers. I'll come back to that slide. So for years, and don't get thrown off by this slide, the whole point is that the way we look at this is just the different classes of trying to kill the myeloma cell. And so we can try and kill it from without. You can see those little blue forks, which is antibody treatments, or we can try and get it from the inside with some of these new drugs. But which of those, though all of those potential targets along the process of the myeloma cell, how do we choose? Which is the important switch? And the only way that we can actually work that out is by research. And you can see along the bottom, there is cell cultures, there's using murine models, and ultimately trials of patients to try and work out what is the Achilles heel of the myeloma cells. So these are the various drugs that we've used along the way. Now, thalidomide is virtually gone, but it's an important history. It's been around for 20 years. It has a good response rate. And like a lot of drugs, and we'll probably talk about this more, their efficacy is increased with the use of steroids, prednisolone and dexamethasone. It's convenient because it's a tablet, but it has side effects like neuropathy. And it also causes sleepiness, and it can increase the risk of blood clotting. And that's true for the derivatives lenalidomide and pomalidomide, but less so. As I've mentioned, we often use steroids, and steroids are here to stay because they will enhance the activity of a lot of drugs. They're our friends because they work quickly. They can help pain, they can help improve kidney function, they have an anti-inflammatory effect. And as I said, they turbocharge the other drugs that we use with them, and they can often be helpful to maintaining a remission. But they can make you feel hyperactive. They can cause tummy irritation. They can increase the risk of infections. They can make your muscles weak. They can increase the risk of thinning of the bones, otherwise known as osteoporosis. And so we really try and limit the dose, and we try and get people off, and they seem to be most important in the first few months. So I think it's very reasonable to keep asking your doctor, do I need to be on this prednisolone dose, particularly as the months go by, because it is there are times in which we can reconsider the use of prednisolone. So we've gone beyond thalidomide and now lenalidomide or Revlimid has become an important frontline therapy. It has a different set of side effects. It doesn't cause the nerve problems or the constipation as much, but it can reduce the blood counts, and that does have an impact on what we can combine it with. So we can keep using lenalidomide and we can combine it with other drugs along the way. And sometimes as time goes on, blood counts can can deteriorate because the lenalidomide is trying to suppress the myeloma. So sometimes, for example, after transplant, when people are using as maintenance treatment, it needs dose adjustment simply because it's suppressing the normal blood counts. It can be used with chemotherapy, as I've said down the bottom, but because of this effect on the blood counts, it can become a bit toxic, lowering the blood counts a bit excessively. So it is a bit hard to combine. And I've mentioned it causes myelosuppression, which is suppression of the bone marrow blood. It can cause thrombosis and rash. They're the most common ones. And it's used now at the time of diagnosis. So in patients that are non-transplant eligible, so the older patients, so it's often used alone or with Velcade, so-called RVD, Revlimid, Velcade, dexamethasone. And then it's also used in transplant eligible patients, again, usually with bortezomib. It can be used post-transplant at maintenance. It can then be used as relapse disease, and it can be used alone or with this antibody that I'll talk about called elotuzumab. And we are allowed to have holidays nowadays. The PBS have changed the rules, and it means that we can have lenalidomide at any time along the course of the disease, used on and off. We don't just have one go at the drug. At this slide, you don't have to remember it except to say we're always looking at combinations. So in the middle there is RD. That stands for Revlimid and low-dose dexamethasone. And pretty much it can be combined with all these different agents that are listed there on the left. And there's trials that back up all of that data. Now, pomalidomide is another thalidomide derivative. It has good single agent activity. It can be used when lenalidomide stopped working. So although it's effective, it can be, although it's similar to lenalidomide, it can be effective even in patients that have had lenalidomide. It's PBS approved, but only if people have failed lenalidomide or Velcade or are intolerant. And it is available in combination, particularly with bortezomib, i.e. Velcade. And it's approved. It was approved for that in 2021, which was great. It can be combined with cyclophosphamide, and it can be combined with the antibodies. But unfortunately, that's not easy to do with the antibodies because of the PBS restrictions. So it's either used practically either used alone, or with bortezomib, that's Velcade, or in combination as part of new clinical trials. Velcade is the drug called bortezomib. It makes the cells commit suicide, and it's now used upfront usually with lenalidomide. It's often used with steroids. It's often used with cyclophosphamide. It used to be given intravenously and now is given as injection under the skin. And it used to be given twice weekly. It still is in certain situations, but often given weekly. So people just come in, have the jab under the skin. And it's one of the major advantages, because I haven't mentioned that there yet, but it is the combination of the daratumumab, the monoclonal antibody, with Velcade has now become a very important combination, and people can have treatments that are acceptable or even given at home. And it's, although drugs are given under the skin and easier, we recognize that by the time you come into the hospital, you parked your car, and you've seen the doctor, it's half a day. So it says there, your appointment with the doctor is at 11:15, but his appointment with you is at 12:15. In other words, it doesn't always work out as simply as we'd like. And Alicia Snowden, my practice nurse here at Precision Hematology at Epworth, Alicia's constantly teaching patients and telling patients and working with patients how to deal with their expectations and the frustrations. And hopefully into the future, post-COVID, we're going to see better ways of giving these drugs in the home environment. Even self-administration of these drugs is really the next step forward. So these drugs, we recognize there's inconvenience, and I think you will find more and more into the future the use of drugs where patients can get them at home. So the problems with Velcade are that it can cause neuropathy, nerve damage, and we're constantly looking out for that. It's available for a wide variety of uses, but probably the biggest two in the last couple of years is its availability with pomalidomide, and also with the use with the monoclonal antibody daratumumab. And so Velcade is very useful, but it does have side effects. And one of its main side effects is nerve damage. And this drug carfilzomib has come along, and you can see the similarity of the mib there, simply because it's of the same family. And carfilzomib has less neuropathy. It probably works a bit better, but it does cause high blood pressure and can cause fluid retention. It's often given ongoing, longer than we give it for Velcade, and it's only available in the relapse setting, so we don't use it up front. So it's a very valuable drug. It is replacing Velcade in some situations, but also augmenting it. And one of the advantages of carfilzomib is that we can give ongoing therapy for long periods of time, and in other words, keep the brake on myeloma. And this is an important concept that I'll just divert from. But the idea of constantly suppressing the myeloma cells makes a lot of sense. And in fact, over the last 10 years, it's become a recognition that patients probably do better if they have constant suppression of the myeloma. Problem is side effects. So for example, Velcade, you can't just keep giving it because you'll get nerve damage. Same, we can't just keep giving thalidomide, you'll get nerve damage. Sometimes with lenalidomide, people get bowel problems. We have to stop the drug. And so we have to try and pick and choose, when should we give people holidays? When should we keep the drug going? And so I think it's a really important just concept there to tell you about, that suppression of the myeloma clone ongoing makes a lot of sense. And so we have to think carefully. I won't say it's wrong to stop the treatment. There are certainly places where we do and we have to stop treatment. But conceptually, if we had the perfect drug with no long-term toxicities, we would keep it going. And an example of that now is the monoclonal antibody daratumumab, where most patients, once they start, they have the induction course of weekly and then 3 weekly and then monthly treatment. And that monthly treatment keeps going. So I'm not going to go through the guidelines, but it's there on our website. We update it to educate doctors around Australia, but you can also have a look at those guidelines. And in those guidelines, we talk about the next available options beyond the drugs that we talked about. And the monoclonal antibodies have been a huge breakthrough. And what they are, they're little fork-like proteins. They're the good guys antibodies. Myeloma produces these bad ones, but antibodies are generally good, and they bind onto the surface of the cell. And what I describe as thinking about them like smashing the cell from the outside, like an egg. And there are 3 monoclonal antibodies that you may hear about. 2 of them are on the PBS. One is daratumumab, and it binds to an antigen or a receptor on the surface of the plasma cell called CD38. And so if you can imagine those little greeny around things on the surface of the cell is the CD38. Daratumumab in blue, binding onto those, and it kills. But it also kills if you, in a helpful way, if you combine it with one of the other drugs. And at the moment, it's only available in Australia by combining it with Velcade, whereas elotuzumab binds against SLAMF7, which is another protein, and it's only available in Australia with lenalidomide. Pound for pound, daratumumab is a bit more powerful than elotuzumab, and so it tends to be used earlier in the disease. Now we can do tricks with those antibodies. So if you can imagine on the left there, we have an antibody. And that antibody is binding onto what's in the light blue, the antigen, or what was that little gold bit on the surface of the cell. But we can manipulate those antibodies by producing 3 different things. And I'll let you focus on the bottom right-hand corner, the bottom of the slide, antibody drug conjugates. And what happens is that we can actually pluck onto, you can see that hexagonal red thing, which is a drug. So we can bind onto that antibody a drug, and it's like a Trojan horse. That antibody can bind onto the cell, and then it goes into the cell, and then that little red drug gets released and can block the cell. So it's like delivering a specific payload into it. And there's a drug called belantamab mafodotin, which is a antibody using binding onto the cell. And the receptor is against a thing called I'll come back to it, BMCA. So it doesn't really matter what it binds onto, but what happens is this antibody binds onto the BMCA, goes inside the cell, the red's released, and it kills the cell. The second thing that you can do is do what's called bispecific T-cell engagers. And what happens is that we get, on the one end of the antibody, it binds onto the myeloma cell, which is or plasma cell, which is in red, and the other end binds onto a T cell. So it's got this double hinge effect. So you've got this double binding. And what it literally does is it pulls the T cell to the plasma cell, and the T cells then kill the plasma cell. And so these bispecific engagers are taking off, and they are incredibly effective, but they are associated with side effects. They're given injections under the skin, and at the moment they're only available through clinical trials. The last is what's called CAR T cells, which is where we actually put the genes of the antibody into a patient's own T cells. So what we do is, this is gene therapy. It is a process by which we collect patients' T cells and we manipulate them genetically to express on the surface these receptors, which can then bind onto the cancer cell directly. So the principles of CAR T cells and bispecific engagers, which are fundamentally the same. They're trying to pull the T cell to the plasma cell, and the T cell then kills the plasma cell. So, as I've said there, if you look at the modification of the diagram, the T cells can be useful by these bispecific antibodies, the so-called BiTEs or CAR T cells, and you can use antibody drug conjugates, such as what I talked to you about, where the payload of the drug gets inside the cell. So this is the state of play at the moment. We have monoclonal antibodies, daratumumab. It's available at first relapse. I shouldn't say first line. It's actually at first line relapse. So it's when patients have, for example, had their transplant and then some years later their disease starts to grow back. Daratumumab, this antibody, is available, and it's available with Velcade. The antibody elotuzumab is also available on the PBS in combination with lenalidomide. There's another antibody called isatuximab through clinical trials. CAR T cells are only available through clinical trials, and I'll talk about those in a second. They are going through the PBS MSAC process, which is where it's reimbursed. Unfortunately, it was knocked back last month on the first round, so they're not available routinely yet. There's a lot of discussion, one could say arguments, between the drug companies that want to produce this, to provide this, versus the government, the funding issues, etc. So you're going to hear about it. We may be asking you for support to take this information to the government so that we can get approved. These BiTE antibodies, the next dot point, is only available through clinical trials. The antibody drug conjugates are through trials as well as a compassionate program, so it is out there. Selinexor, this small molecule, which I'll talk about briefly, is on the PBS. Carfilzomib, the proteasome inhibitors, Velcade, carfilzomib, and ixazomib are variably available. So this is the sort of standard paradigm now in 2022. If you're a transplant candidate, you usually get the so-called RVD, which is bortezomib, lenalidomide, dexamethasone. We collect stem cells. Then the third line is that people have high-dose melphalan with stem cell transplant, and then they go on to maintenance treatment. Remission lasts some years. It's usually anything between 3.5 to 5 years, and that will vary. And then typically frontline first relapse is Velcade plus the monoclonal antibody daratumumab. And then these other options for further relapse, further treatment options, which include lenalidomide, pomalidomide, carfilzomib, and selinexor. And then, of course, there's clinical trials. And on the right hand, you can see that arrow pointing downward, that's Zometa, that's zoledronic acid for the bone strengthener. For non-transplant patients, well, there's a number of treatment options depending on what they'll tolerate. Lenalidomide alone or in combination with Velcade, then often maintenance lenalidomide, and then again at relapse, same options. Selinexor is this new drug. It's an inhibitor of a protein. So that picture on the left is just simply the inside of a cell. And without going into much detail, all it does is it blocks this process inside the cell. So it's not an antibody. It's not binding on the outside. It's not stimulating the T cells from the outside. What it's doing is it's getting inside the cell and blocking an important cell process. And without that process going ahead, then the cell doesn't like it. It goes into a bit of spasm and dies. Selinexor is effective, but it's only available in patients who've relapsed after prior treatments of lenalidomide and bortezomib. And it has a response rate of approaching 30%. So it's not a wonder drug, but it can be very helpful in some patients, and is usually given as a single agent. So in the last 10 minutes, I'm just going to talk to you about, focus in on about CAR T cells and immunotherapy in general. And so when we think about cancer treatments, we've always had surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and now we have what's called precision treatment, where we're looking at the genomics, and I'm not talking about that today, but also immune therapies. And we've got these immune therapies because basically we've sequenced the genome, so we understand the genetics of the human. We've now got huge computational capacity to make a large amount of data and process it. We've got understanding biological pathways within the cell, and we've got the whole concept of boosting the immune system. And also we can then learn about this, and using things like the synchrotron, which we have one here in Victoria, for example, the universities and the drug companies can start producing designer drugs. And this is really what we're heading towards in our better treatments. And one of these key treatments has been this so-called CAR T cells, this chimeric antigen receptor T cells. And this is basically a bag of gene-modified, genetically engineered T cells. And this is an example of Emma Whitehead, who had her CAR T cells for her acute leukemia now 9 years ago, and she's now cured of her disease, having failed even a bone marrow transplant. And how did we get there? Well, the first step was that we recognized that the immune system is important in the surveillance of cancer. So the immune system's out there trying to suppress cancers. And this is when the immune system changed. When we went from a jellyfish to a jawed fish 500 million years ago, that was even before the Iguazu Falls in South America was a river. It is, for any of those who've been to the massive waterfalls, they were flat rivers when these jawfish came. These sea lampreys still exist, and the difference is that they have lymphocytes. They are the first evolutionary being that had a lymphocyte that was able to recognize something that is non-self. And since then, our immune system has developed. And this is fundamentally the capacity for a T cell to recognize a target, such as a virus, a bacteria, or even a cancer. And that green bit in the middle is the immune synapse, where a lot of communication goes on, activates the T cell once the recognition takes place. And so the immune synapse means that the T cells are then able to produce chemicals which will then kill the target cell. And that immune synapse there is complex. I'm not going to go through it in any detail, except there's a lot of molecules talking to each other that's recognizing self and non-self, making sure that that immune system, like a seesaw, is kept in a delicate balance, recognizing T cells, recognizing foreign cancer cells or viruses, etc. And so this is this concept of constant surveillance. The second concept is that as soon as cancers start to grow, they suppress our own immune system. And so our immune system really is designed to be somewhat subdued, so that we can recognize viruses and bacteria. It's always on guard. It's always, tapping around and jumping around and looking for things that are invading us. But if we let our immune system do everything it really wanted to do, we'd all end up with significant autoimmune diseases. And so what happens is normally our immune system is just a little suppressed, so we're not attacking ourselves, and it just fires up when attacking the enemy. And so if you dial up the immune system too strong, one can end up with what's called autoimmunity, which can range from rheumatoid arthritis to nerve damage, things like multiple sclerosis, etc. So we want this, the immune synapse is critical in, just excuse me, just got to get rid of my phone call. This immune synapse is really important in making our immune system go from red to green or green to red. And so cancers subvert that process. So cancers immediately suppress the immune system down to a red light. And so they can't attack the cancer. So how do we do that? Well, in 2018, the Nobel Prize of Honyo and Allison was based on this immune synapse, which you can see in the middle there, where they were able to develop drugs that were able to switch back on the patient's own immune system. So we've learned ways in which we can use the immune system to fight cancers, and CAR T cells is the classic example. And what happens is that if you can imagine, if you look right at the center, what looks like two planets, but in fact, the big one is a tumor cell. In this example, it's a lymphocyte, it's a CD19 on the tumor, and the T cell. And if you highlight in that box there, it's got a whole lot of receptors. And the receptors are genetically modified. So on what it's trying to bind onto, that yellow bullet, so we can actually produce that green fork by inserting the specific gene. By inserting the specific gene. And so we've got the good guys, the T cells, which are trying to kill the bad guys, the plasma cells. And so how we do that is that we insert that receptor into the cell. And these newly modified good guy Batman and Robin T cells are what we call serial killers, because they can kill multiple cancer cells along the way. And so we get that whack, and then they can continue killing these cells. And how do we do it? Well, in the middle there, you can see the patient. We put them on an apheresis machine, like a stem cell collection. The cells then are grown for 10 to 14 days in culture. They have a specific gene put on their surface, and they're grown in a cocktail that helps the T cells grow over a period of time. The genes are transduced, and after that period of growth, they have these new little red things on their surface, which is able to be reinfused into the patient like a blood transfusion, which binds onto then the target, in other words, the myeloma inside the patients. And so, for example, here at Epworth, you can see here the apheresis machine and the special processing that's required for these sort of cellular productions. For this sort of process, it's complicated. And you can see here on the left, what happens is we collect the patients, and then the specimen is sent to the production facility, which is typically somewhere overseas, Germany, America, the UK, and there are production facilities being developed here in Australia where that 12 days of processing takes place, and then it goes back into the patient. In other words, it travels back to Australia, is stored away until it's required for treatment. And so I really just put this up to remind you, it's really what we call a living drug. It can potentially cure acute leukemia. In that situation, it's replace bone marrow transplants, and it's very much considered a one-off treatment at the moment, in that it's aimed for a one-off durable response. And it's approved in Australia for different types of lymphoma. They're not approved for myeloma yet. And your job into the future, people, is to help us get the government to pay for these treatments. And so these sorts of CAR T cell treatments are available just at 1 or 2 centres in each state around Australia, but will be obviously increasing over time. But people get referred in. This is our facility at Peter Mac, which is an entire floor dedicated to the production of CAR T cells. And this is something that we've been working on for 20 years. And we hope to be a production facility for the production of CAR T cells there. But it is an area that's constantly changing, and it is incredibly exciting. And you can see here that these are the trials that are being done for CAR T cells around the world. Each of them represents one trial with the different companies doing different CAR T cell research for different diseases with different modifications of the T cells and the CAR constructs. But they're not without their risk. There are toxicities, because what can happen is that if you dial up the immune system too much, you end up with toxic side effects, which can be fundamentally things like autoimmune diseases. And as you can see there in the brain, neurotoxicity. So they're not common and they're manageable, but they exist. And so it isn't something that is taken lightly when we recommend CAR T cell therapies. And it's also incredibly expensive. This is a bit old, but this is the cost of CAR T cells for acute lymphocytic leukemia, which is around the $700,000 mark per patient. So it's a one-off treatment, bearing in mind that the antibodies like daratumumab cost close to anything between $70,000 and $100,000 per year. So it doesn't take long to add those up if patients are getting the ongoing benefit. Again, like everything, costs will fall with time. And I often tell the story of when I was a registrar at the Alfred. I remember the Alfred Hospital radiologists questioning, would they ever be able to spend $1 million for a CT scanner at the Alfred? And is it worth it? This goes back to the late 1980s, and things have changed a lot in the last 40 plus years. But it shows you that now CT scanners are on every corner. They take about less than 5 minutes to do, and are available in operating suites. What's going to happen with this treatment over the next few years? Costs, of course, will come down. So we can do lots of tricks with the antibodies. As I've said, we've got the CAR T cells at the top. We've got these bispecific engagers, which are like drugs. They're given as an injection. And to be blunt, they are competing with each other because the CAR Ts are very bespoke. It's a process, 12 days of growth, whereas the bispecific engagers can be off the shelf. But the CAR T cells are modified for a lifetime. So if the myeloma starts to grow, the CAR T cells potentially can kick back in. Again, it requires a lot of work to be done. Really, in terms of CAR T cell therapies, if you compare it to flying, we're not we're not at the Wright brothers, and we're not at supersonic flight, but we're somewhere around the Second World War. In other words, we're up and going and effective, but we certainly haven't optimized it yet. But it can be given safely. So there's lots of these receptors on the surface of the plasma cell that we can use antibodies for. CD38, which is daratumumab, SLAMF7, which is elotuzumab, both on the PBS, and there's this protein called BCMA. And BCMA is the target that's used for the antibody drug conjugates. And just to explain that again, you've got the antibody with the payload, which is those orange things, which bind onto the surface of the plasma cell. They're sucked into the plasma cell. They then kill it directly with that chemical reaction. And the bispecific engagers are concept the same as the CAR Ts. You've got the good guys and the bad guys. You're trying to drag the good guys, the Batman and Robins, up to the tumor cell and ultimately kill it through the normal mechanisms. We've got these other small molecules. I've mentioned selinexor, and as I've mentioned before, on the right-hand side, we've got selinexor and venetoclax. Selinexor is approved. It's really for patients who failed the other prior therapies, and this drug called venetoclax, which is only really useful for patients who have certain types of myeloma. And ultimately, we want to have specific proteins for all of the different, specific drugs for all of the different little proteins that are inside the side of the cell. And so selinexor is just, and venetoclax are just picking off two specific pathways. And you can see here, there's all these different ways of targeting the cell. And ultimately, the idea is, just going back a slide, is that we're trying to pick off a whole lot of new targets along the way. That's one of my colleagues, Ken Anderson, talking at one of the ASH meetings about all of the potential targets. But it doesn't always work. And I've been to a number of those meetings, and there's lots of hope. And then, unfortunately, there may be significant toxicities, and drugs don't go ahead. But that's how we learn, ultimately through clinical trials, to work out what is the right switch that's working in myeloma. And clinical trials develop new treatments. So at the moment, we've got clinical trials for CAR Ts, BITE cells, monoclonal antibodies, the smashing the egg, isatuximab, small molecules venetoclax. It provides lots more options for patients, and you as patients need to ask, are there clinical trials that are suitable for me? And don't be afraid of them, because they are often about delivering new drugs that may not be available. And they come in different phases. Phase 1 is where it's used very early in the course of the disease. Phase 1, it's used very early for very early development in the course of drug development. It's often given in low doses and then built up. And there's often delays. So sometimes you have to be patient to say, is this new drug available? Well, it's on hold. We're waiting for the next cohort to open. Phase 2 studies take that the next step, try to work out how the approximate response rate, and phase 3 is where you have randomization. And sometimes you're randomized to the arms that don't include the active drug. So you need to, not all trials are the same design. They often have strict eligibility criteria. In other words, are only suitable at certain points in the disease. And one has to have good kidney function, good lung function, make sure there's no other major cancers, and the disease must be measurable. In other words, that there must be a handle by which we can evaluate the response of the treatment. So I'm just having a bit of trouble with this clicker. It keeps switching off. And it tends to be at certain centres. And so it does require some commitment, potentially travel, and of course time. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. It does come with its problems in getting people on trials because of these situations. So don't feel guilty if you can't go onto the trial, because it simply just may not suit you. So venetoclax is an example of the trials that are being done now. This is a drug that's been used and is approved for chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and it certainly has a role in multiple myeloma, and you may well see it being used around for this disease and for amyloidosis. So venetoclax, MCL1 inhibitors, selinexor have all been gone through clinical trials recently, and some are approved, and we anticipate others will be approved with time. So these are really the pillars of which we're attacking cancer. Immunotherapy there on the right is really what we're putting a lot of money on in terms of being the right horse into the future for myeloma. Just to give you an idea, I like this slide. This is FDA approvals in 2017 on the right and 2018 on the left for blood cancers. And 17 new drugs were approved in the United States for blood cancers across the board, not just myeloma, in 2017, and another 17 in 2017, there were 17 drugs approved. In 2018, there was also 17 drugs approved. And in each year, only one of those drugs was actually a chemotherapy drug, believe it or not. All of them were either CAR T cells, immunotherapy with antibodies that I've described, or small molecules like the selinexor or venetoclax that are getting inside the cell. And so this is how things are changing. So I'll leave you with that. We've got 10 minutes to chat, and I'm very happy to take questions on really any subject, and even if it's not all about just new drugs. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Laura and Emma. Or Laura, I think, is going to give me the questions.
Thank you so much, Miles. It's so incredibly inspiring to see the growth that has happened in the world of myeloma over recent years, and to know that there's so many more available options to people should that time of relapse happen. I've got a few questions that you've touched on already today, but I'll just reiterate them so that the person who asked has a clear answer. So Gary has asked firstly about when selinexor is available. So from memory, you touched that it was available for relapse disease post the person already having Revlimid and bortezomib.
Correct. So it's now available on the PBS only in the last few months. Mm-hmm. So your doctor may have said to you, no, it's not available yet. Well, it's now available. It's a tablet. It's given typically weekly. It's got very acceptable side effects, usually well tolerated. Fatigue is the main one, and it can cause a bit of nausea, but mostly well managed.
Mhm.
And patients must have had lenalidomide or Velcade, and or lenalidomide or Velcade, and pomalidomide, either relapsed on it or not able to tolerate it. So, for example, if someone's had lenalidomide after their transplant, had carfilzomib at relapsed, or had bortezomib, and then had pomalidomide, maybe hadn't tolerated it, they would be, or had relapsed on it, it's available. And the doctor just has to write a prescription.
Yep. Thank you for explaining that so well. We have another question from Tim, who is reflecting on the issues surrounding CAR T being made and the challenge of making those cells, and wants to know, can you comment on allogeneic CAR T cells in use for people with myeloma?
Okay, so very early days yet. So the terminology is such that autologous means your own, allogeneic means from somebody else. And so the holy grail for CAR Ts would be if you have myeloma where CAR T cell therapies are suitable, and that in the laboratory or in the pharmacy, there is frozen bags of hundreds of different types of CAR T cells sitting there waiting to be used. We take a blood test from the patient and say, this is the match, just like having a cross match for blood, and that the CAR Ts can be pulled out of the freezer, thawed out, and given to the patient as that treatment. That's so-called allogeneic. So allogeneic simply means getting it from somebody else. So it's like a blood transfusion. People go to blood bank, give their blood, it's then stored at blood bank, person in the hospital needs it, there's a cross match, and it's done. Same concept, except there's a lot more, obviously, than just a blood transfusion. And so hopefully into the future, blood banks would be able to collect people's T cells. You know, people, just like people donate plasma, they might be tapped on the shoulder and said, please, can we collect your T cells so people can make CAR Ts to be stored away. The issue is about rejection and increasing toxicity and things called graft versus host disease. At this stage, the T cells have to be manipulated to stop the overreaction of the immune system. But we're, for example, at Epworth next year doing a CAR T cell program for lymphoma on exactly that, allogeneic T cells, which are actually coming from America. The T cells come from America for this particular trial.
Oh, it's so interesting, and I think we'll keep seeing changes in the world of myeloma in this space as well. I have a question from Roz, who asks about why daratumumab stops working. If we know that it has that myeloma-specific target, is it because the cancerous plasma cells mutate, or they just, can you explain why that stops? Yep.
So I'm not sure if I can tell you the answer, because there's probably a number of answers and they're probably different for every individual patient. So I suppose the first thing to say is that even in some patients where the antibody binds and they express the protein, the CD38, some people do not respond at all. And so what's happening is that it's a bit like saying, why doesn't a vaccine for the flu always work? Because the cells have ways of getting around it. And so sometimes the resistance or the mechanisms that the antibody is using to kill, and I didn't really touch on this, but what happens usually is that an antibody will bind onto the surface and then activate pathways that make the cells shudder and die and crack up. And that's because they start punching holes in it. And some cells and some antibodies won't be able to do that powerfully enough, or the plasma cell can overcome it. So this happens in people who are primarily resistant. And what we think happens over time is that the plasma cells progressively evolve or mutate. So just like they can become resistant to chemo, they can become resistant to the antibody treatment over time. And we don't really understand why, because some people can be on these drugs for years.
Mm-hmm.
Some people can have a deep response and stop the antibodies, and the disease can remain in remission. And others do start to break through while they're getting the treatment. And even if we increase the frequency, it doesn't seem to help. It's just developed or evolved in having these resistance mechanisms. And people are spending a lot of time looking at what these resistant mechanisms are. And that's why I said I can't really answer the question accurately, only by saying, giving you the concepts of why it might not work or stop working.
Is there a group of patients that you would anticipate them having that kind of response with, like people who you think would be more high risk or more likely to relapse through therapy?
Another really good question. The answer is no. We don't. And in fact, to answer the question in another way, we have lots of patients who have relapsed after their initial treatment quite quickly, within a year. Then you put them on daratumumab and boom, they're in remission for 5 years. So their second line treatment is better than their first. And so it is about the total different way of the mechanisms in which all these different drugs work. And that's why I spent at the start talking about the different places that it works, because we're trying to kill the plasma cell from different directions. But no, it's a really good question. So, for example, if someone's had lenalidomide and relapse, we sort of feel that we probably should change to Velcade or carfilzomib or something else rather than giving them pomalidomide as a sort of what we call change of class, as a general concept. But even that's just a bit of guesswork, because I've got lots of patients who've responded well to pomalidomide immediately after their lenalidomide.
Yeah, no, I echo your experiences there. I've had many patients who, at point of first relapse, doing amazingly well on their second line of therapy, sometimes quite unexpectedly. I've got time for one quick last question.
I'll just make one comment. Unfortunately, daratumumab is only available at first relapse by the PBS. And this is one of the frustrating things as doctors that we have, is that we've got some patients who've had their second line treatment. So, for example, may have had carfilzomib and then missed out, and the antibody's not available. So we're trying to get people onto clinical trials to get them access to the monoclonal antibodies. And there is a compassionate program for the availability of daratumumab, but patients, unfortunately, must have had all of the other treatments to get access to it. So it is one of our biggest frustrations.
Yeah, it's such a complex system to learn how to navigate, for sure. Our last question, and the questions we didn't get to today, we will answer by email, was just, John asks, is there a need to alert people to have blood tests to detect myeloma? Should we be screening people for myeloma?
So the answer is that the whole screening process for cancer is very controversial, because it's about cost effectiveness. How many people do you need to test? And unfortunately, antibodies, the presence of these antibodies in people can often be an aging phenomena, which doesn't necessarily lead to myeloma. I probably see for every patient with a protein in their blood, 1 out of 10 actually has myeloma or develops myeloma. So screening people would result in huge amounts of false positives. And then how far do you test them for myeloma, and how much does that cost people? Because it's not in families, and there's not people who are considered high risk, it's not like, for example, testing people with breast cancer and making sure their relatives are tested, or bowel cancer. And so that it is complicated. Now, having said that, doing a protein on a sibling is not inexpensive. It's not it's not that expensive. And so if patients' relatives are worried, assessing their immune system and telling their GP, look, my brother's got myeloma. I just want to be sure that it's okay. It's actually just a simple blood test that can be repeated 5 years. So if there is anxiety in the family, it can be done, and it's worth them speaking to their GP because it's now no longer a particularly expensive test.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful answer. Thank you. That's all we have time for today in relation to the Q&A. Thank you so much again, Miles. We always appreciate hearing you at the end of the year. You are so refined in your explanations of some really, intense concepts. And the audience always feeds back that it's a really easy to understand seminar. So thank you again. Thank you, CVP, for your work in bringing this to the national audience. Our festive campaign is in full swing. We would so appreciate if you share within your communities our festive appeal. We hope you enjoy this festive time with your friends and your family. Hopefully some warm weather arrives in Melbourne sometime soon. All the best over the next few months from Myeloma Australia, and we look forward to connecting with you in 2023. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.